All right, welcome to Yeoman. I'm your host, Jeff Graham. Joining me this morning of Constitution Day, September 17th, 2024, is Don Boudreaux. Don is a professor of economics at George Mason University. He's an associate senior fellow with the American Institute for Economic Research and a prolific writer on free market economics, international trade, and law. In addition to his books on those topics, you can find Don's writings in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the National Review, the Library for Economics and Liberty, and many other places. And he is also the driving force behind the outstanding blog Cafe Hayek. Don, welcome to Yeoman. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me, Jeff. I'm very happy to be here.
Likewise, it's great to see you again. So, Constitution Day. How are you observing Constitution Day today?
So, as you mentioned, I have a blog, Cafe Hayek, and on that blog every day, I have a quotation of the day. And so I remembered, and I load them up a day or two ahead of time, and I remember that September 17th, 1787 is the date that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia gave their approval to that document. So it's called Constitution Day. And so I am reading a wonderful book by the American historian Jeffrey Wood, Gordon Wood. I'm sorry, I'm looking at your name, Jeff. Gordon Wood, and called Empire of Liberty. And he's got a nice little quotation about the purposes of the Constitution there. And so I put that as the quotation of the day at my blog. But I always remember it's the Cato Institute, who I have an affiliation with. Typically, not every year, but very often, will have a conference in Washington to commemorate Constitution Day, and so I think that's what emblazoned it in my memory.
Well, two things that I'm thinking about, and we'll link definitely to. It'll probably be 10 days or so before this is live, so okay. Not quite dated, but we'll link back to those things at Cafe Hayek. But a question I ask is Constitution Day a day of celebration, or is it a day of mourning?
Yeah. Well, so you're talking to I'm a pretty radical libertarian.
Right. Yes.
And my radicalness hasn't really diminished over the course of my lifetime. I just turned 66 years old, and I'm about as devoted to the principles of individual liberty and freedom as I ever was, and have a natural intolerance and distaste for any one or any set of institutions that interfere with that. Nevertheless, we live in an imperfect world, and we have to take a lot of what is in this imperfect world as given. We can't change even the imperfect and changeable things all at one time. So I genuinely, I find myself being an admirer of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. I don't believe it's a perfect document by any means. I don't think any sensible person, including any of the delegates in Philadelphia 37 years ago, yep, would have said that. But it has managed somehow to keep power more divided than it otherwise would have. We have had since the beginning of the Republic, peaceful transfers of power. That is no mean accomplishment in a world in which power transfers have often been bloody. Mm-hmm. So we could spend the rest of our time together just listing the imperfections that I find in the Constitution, but by and large, I'm a fan compared to what I estimate would be the alternative to it. I think it's worked reasonably well. It's pretty good, and one thing I've learned as I've gotten older is pretty good is pretty good, and we should often settle for pretty good.
Yeah. In construction, we'll often say finished is better than perfect.
Yeah.
I do, and that's something it's not just yours, but it's you have the recurring question you ask regularly in your writing: compared to what?
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
what do we have to compare it to that's better? Uh, well, I was thinking as I was reflecting on how we might start this morning. So 237 years ago, you have like what bring forward in time James Madison, maybe also Alexander Hamilton from 237 years ago, and let them say maybe flow through the history of the United States and sort of get a survey of
Hmm.
it and bring them today to this point today. I, I am curious what you think each of those two would think about where we are today, and then maybe also what would Jefferson think? Not at the Constitutional Convention. What would Thomas Jefferson think, and then also maybe Patrick Henry.
Yeah. So one thing I believe that they would all, and Henry, of course, was an opponent of the Constitution,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
um, that they would all, even Patrick Henry, would recognize is that the document signed in 1787, ratified in 1789, um, is for all of the praise that I just gave it, moderate praise that I just gave it. It certainly has been modified over the years, mostly by court rulings, a little bit by formal amendment, but mostly by court rulings and just changes in the culture, and modified mostly in ways I think that Madison, Hamilton, Jefferson, and Henry would regard as unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the 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 most one of the most important features of the Constitution that was taken for granted by those men, um, it was the construction of enumerated powers. So the federal government, the national government, was not conceived as some superior entity that would use the states and local governments as just administrative units. But a lot of, since the progressive era of 120 or so years ago, that's how many, I think it's still how most progressives think of state governments. The national government is the government. And then we have these little administrative units
Mm-hmm.
called Georgia and Virginia. And the government can, government in Washington can act through them. And so the Article 1, Section 8 enumerates the powers granted to the national government. They're very limited. They're very precise, except the last one, which says, and the government should have all the power to do, what's necessary to carry out the preceding enumerated powers. And of course, the way the Constitution is read now, even by, maybe even especially by conservative jurists, is that unless it's specifically a power specifically denied to the federal government, the government has the power to do that. And that's a complete reversal of the meaning of the Constitution. The federal government, the vast majority of what it does, the Constitution does not grant the federal government the power to do what it does.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in that sense, it's been a failure. The successes that I alluded to earlier come in other dimensions. Keeping the 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 three branches independent of each other, although the independence of the uh, executive branch from the legislative branch is increasingly becoming worse. It's disintegrating. So anyway, what they would say, I think they would be surprised at how little we in the early 21st century understand what was written and agreed to in the late 18th century.
Do you think? Do you think Hamilton would have felt?
I think even Hamilton,
Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I mean, of course, he's of the framers. He's the one who was most intent on having a powerful national government.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Madison was in between. He wasn't so much interested in a powerful national government as he was worried about powerful state governments, and so he wanted the national government to be able to reduce the excesses of democracy that Madison feared would arise at the state level. But I think Hamilton might say something like, "Well, wow, in a way, this is good. What's happened over the ensuing almost 2.5 centuries is that the national government has, in fact, gotten closer to the kind of power that I wanted it to have. But I have to admit, this is not what was written and agreed to in the actual document called the U.S. Constitution." Jefferson, of course, would be appalled at
Henry would probably feel vindicated.
That's exactly right. He would say, "I told you so.
Mm-hmm.
I told you so." As you can tell, Jeff, I have these very ambiguous feelings about the Constitution. I mean, it in a lot of ways it hasn't worked. Nevertheless, I'll just go back to what I said earlier. I do fear, and maybe this is just the old man in me speaking. I do fear that had we had something radically different, that we'd be in even worse shape now.
Mm-hmm.
So, but who knows?
Like
you can't rerun the experiment.
Yeah, I feel like is ambivalence the right word? I'm not sure, but I think I'm reasonably aligned with you on my feelings about it.
Ambivalence is a good word.
There were opportunities for improvement, and some, in history, we probably took we definitely took some turns that pulled us in a direction that's not great. And with that said, I am reflecting on it maybe just now in the moment. I'm kind of amazed at the integrity of the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
And then it's kind of ebbed and flowed in terms of how strong that is. But where we are today, I'm both optimistic that the rights afforded to us in the Bill of Rights are going to be protected, and that the legal system in general has worked pretty well to protect those. And if there's a feature in the government that is in our Constitution that seems to have worked really well, it has been that.
I agree. I want to mention one other source of what I regard as incredible constitutional success. But before I mention that, on the Bill of Rights, there was the Murphy versus Missouri decision.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Right. And a lot of.
So for our listeners, it blows my mind that people were not aware that this was going on.
Yeah.
So I think it was initially Missouri versus Biden. But
Murphy is the Surgeon General, or maybe?
The Surgeon General, right? Yeah, and so I'll let you probably can do a better job of briefly explaining that case and its outcome.
Well, I'm not familiar enough with the details for anyone to take this as an accurate summary of just what happened. But during the pandemic, of course, starting with the Biden administration, but certainly accelerating with the Trump administration, but certainly accelerating to them categorically different under the Biden administration. The national government, the executive branch especially, the executive branch exclusively, as far as I can tell, pressured Facebook and other social media companies to publish only, to allow to be broadcast only those bits of information about the pandemic that the executive branch thought were appropriate, and to suppress others that they thought to be inappropriate.
And this was to just try to be as fair as possible, this was the plaintiff's allegation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's right.
And it was successful through the lower courts.
That's right.
Successfully argued through the lower courts and ended up at the Supreme Court.
Yeah. And I'm not, even though I have a law degree, I'm not really a lawyer. I don't recall exactly, and because these things do matter. I can't recall exactly what the particular legal question or questions were that were before the U.S. Supreme Court, but they had something to do with, is it a violation of the First Amendment? Does the government violate citizens' First Amendment rights by uh, uh, colluding with or pressuring private companies regarding the kinds of information those private companies are allowed to or not allowed to disseminate, or be allowed to be disseminated on their platforms.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that the ruling, so the government won the case, but it won the case on some peculiar ground of lack of standing of
Right.
the plaintiffs to bring the case. So it wasn't a ruling that the First Amendment allows the government to do this. It was a ruling on a very technical matter.
That's right.
And so, while I'm disappointed in the outcome of Mirth, I think it's awful that the federal government was doing this. To me, it's a clear violation of the First Amendment. Um, uh, uh, but it's still. I brought it up because even despite that terrible ruling, in my view, I think you're correct that by and large, the First Amendment has stood as a bulwark to protect ordinary people's rights to express themselves and be free of government pressure
Mm-hmm.
on those expressions. Not perfect, but the constitutional success. Another one that I do want to mention.
I'll just like to pause you there. I'll link to. I'll try and find what I think is like the best explanation of what happened in that case, and link to that in show notes. And I'll add to it that I don't think it's quite over. I think the courts found that the plaintiffs didn't have standing, meaning they, as my understanding, they could not demonstrate harm.
Yeah, that's right. And so they were not entitled to be before the court.
I think the court acknowledged that the government mayn't do what it was doing, which is threaten others to do things that it is not within their own power to do. I believe the court acknowledged that, but they.
I'm not sure they got to that. They got to that question.
Maybe I'm combining those with the dissenting opinions. But I don't believe it's quite over because there's still a Biden versus Berenson case.
I believe that's correct. And you're right. It's not whatever these kinds of big issues are determined by the highest court on some technical question that doesn't go to the substance of the case. It's always not over. Mm-hmm. Someone with standing will come forward, and then the courts will be obliged to rule on the merits and not just on the technicalities of who's standing before the court seeking relief.
So, I interrupted you to make that interjection, but please go on.
Just really quickly, the one amazing success we take it for granted today is that the Constitution has been remarkably good at maintaining throughout the United States. We're a gigantic transcontinental nation. It's keeping us a big free trade zone. The term wasn't used in the 18th century, but that's what has happened. The Commerce Clause has been interpreted, I think, appropriately to prevent states from protecting in-state producers from out-of-state competition.
Huh.
And
I'm glad to hear your feeling about that. That's just as a regular consumer and entrepreneur, I feel like there's a lot of exceptions to that. Like it's not been across the board.
Well, so obviously the Constitution does give to the federal government, unfortunately, the power to regulate international commerce, foreign trade. And I think it abuses that
and
power.
Hopefully we'll get into that topic, tariffs.
My favorite topic, yeah. And so there's this tension, and I understand it's a tension, and this is just this is unavoidable. States have the power to legislate, to govern, and regulate the safety, health, and morals of their citizens. State governments have that power.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have the power under the Constitution to protect in-state producer X, producer in Georgia, from competition coming from Hawaii or Montana or Florida or any other state for that matter. And very often the states will try, they're very clever at this, will try to mask a protectionist measure behind an excuse of legislating to protect the citizens' safety, health, and morals. And it's very difficult for the courts to always get it right. They don't always get it right, but I think I can't think of a single issue on which the federal courts have ruled over the past nearly 2.5 centuries
Mm-hmm.
that they've more consistently gotten right than on this one. When it becomes the courts, particularly the Supreme Courts, is especially attuned to special interest group politics at the state level, seeking protection from out-of-state competition, and if they sense that that's what's going on, they'll rule it as violating the Commerce Clause. And you can find exceptions; it's not perfect, but we do have largely a giant free trade zone within the U.S. compared to what we would have if the Commerce Clause was not interpreted as preventing the states from using their legislative and executive powers, from protecting individual producers within states from competition coming from producers in other U.S. states.
Mm-hmm. Where my thought was going was on licensing, or related things, or those sorts of things.
Yeah. So occupation. I mean, so these are the great exception that fly under the rule. The states have the power to protect their citizens' safety, health, and morals, and so lots of states think they have to protect the safety of the citizens by requiring hair braiders to take 10,000 hours of classwork before they can go into businesses. Of course, it's ridiculous. And at the individual state level, there's a lot of this stuff, and the Commerce Clause doesn't protect against that. These are solely in-state, I think, predations against the citizens of those states by special interest groups within those states. But what the Commerce Clause prevents is one state government saying, okay, if you are a resident of Georgia, you only need 10 hours of hair braiding training to be a hair braider. But if you come from some other state and you want to set up hair braiding practice, you need 1,000 hours.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I guess even on that topic, I'm feeling pretty optimistic about the amount of scrutiny, even the hair braiding thing, or occupational licensing is getting right now, as both as a regressive and regressive restraint of trade, or an overreach of government. So is that getting attacked on the state level, or is that getting attacked on the federal level?
So, one of the best organizations out there now is the Institute for Justice, IJ,
Totally. Yeah,
located in Arlington, Virginia now.
I think we probably lauded IJ on this podcast now like 35 times.
They deserve everyone, and to double or triple it.
Yeah.
And they have been just intrepid they do other things, of course, but they've been very good at taking cases that they think are winnable at the state level. And so much depends upon upon the nature of the particular regulation or legislation. And so a particular, say, particular occupational licensing statute might be perfectly consistent with the U.S. Constitution. It does nothing at the state level to call a U.S. constitutional question to the mat, but they're often in violation of state constitutions. State constitutions are written differently, and they all if IJ finds some provision in a state constitution that it believes is inconsistent with the occupational licensing statute that has been used to shut down a client of IJ's, IJ will go in, and it's, they don't win every case, but they have a remarkably good record. They do fantastic work. And so, yes, I agree with you. I think there does seem to be, over the past few years, more attention being drawn to the ridiculousness of these occupational licensing restrictions, and the Institute for Justice, and a handful of other places.
Yeah, the Pacific Legal
Foundation. I think Mountain States as well. I'm not sure, but certainly Institute for Justice. They are the leader.
Yeah, and I need to have. I will. I know Ari Bargill. I need to have him on with.
They're just great. But this is when governments do this kind of stuff. I mean, they're constantly beholden.
Well, industries encourage them to do this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like, I was, had just returned to the state of Georgia from South Carolina. I'm from Atlanta, and had come back here, when I was when I was starting a software company. And it was in the construction industry, and it was a time that Georgia was talking about implementing home building licensing. It had never had it before. Home building licensing before. And of course, the argument was you couldn't look around and be like, well, clearly states that have licensing have much higher quality than those that don't, or after they've implemented licensing, quality has gone up and customers have been protected. That you couldn't point to anything like that. But the biggest advocate to implement licensing standards was the Georgia's Home Builders Association, and of course, all of the existing builders were grandfathered into the licensing requirement. I might be being a little bit unfair. With
no,
that.
I don't
Probably
think
not much.
I don't think you are. You show me an occupational licensing statute, and 999 times out of 1,000. I will show you an instance where there are no consumers complaining about what's going on. No consumers complaining about health issues, danger issues. It's some producers who don't want competition, and they see the occupational licensing statute as a means of protecting them from competition. And economists have a lot of fun studying these things because they always have, for economists, predictable, but for most people, these are sort of unpredictable, unseen consequences. One of my favorites is a study done. It's an old study now, but I think it still holds. A study done back in the early 80s of occupational licensing of electricians across different states. And so every state has some minimum requirement for you to set up shop as an electrician selling your services. But some states have much higher restrictions, much more burdensome requirements on who can sell their services as an electrician and who can't. And so there was a famous study done in the early 80s and tracking the number of household electrocutions according to how strict the states were each state's requirements to set up shop as an electrician. Mm-hmm. And so the theory would be, well, those states that have really, really tight requirements, those states, they're going to have a lot fewer electrocutions, home electrocutions, than in states where the licensing requirements are a lot more lenient. And what they found, of course, is the opposite. States with very strict requirements to set up shop as an electrician, in those states, the incidence of household electrocutions was much higher than in states that had very strict requirements. And the reason, of course, being that when the restrictions are very tight, many fewer people are able to become electricians. So the price of hiring a professional electrician is much higher. And so what people do is they don't hire the professional
Yeah.
electrician. They either do their work, electrical work on their own, or they don't do it at all. They just live with bad electrical
Right.
wiring longer. Yeah. And so unfortunately, we're able to document, we economists who do study these things, we're able to document the extra fatalities and extra ill health effects of these regulations.
Well, that's so outstanding that all that documentation and research has persuaded everyone.
Yeah, it hasn't persuaded. Who knows? I mean, I do think that it would remind me of this is our discussion of the Institute for Justice. I know that in a lot of their briefs that they submit to courts, and I've never been to a courtroom listening to an IJ lawyer argue a case, but I'm guessing they do it sometimes. They will use some of this research that are done by that's done by good economists, saying to the courts, look, the purpose is, the stated purpose is to increase safety in our state. Well, look at the outcome. The outcome is decreased safety,
Right.
And that has to have some impact on
Right.
some courts.
Well, I think about too. We in 2 prior episodes we've talked a lot about land use and the law, particularly zoning.
Yeah.
Both with Ilya Soman and Charlie Gardner, and the research that they have published is totally being used by organizations like Institute for Justice, and
Yeah.
I think increase. So I would come back to this. I'm optimistic, like having paid attention at least to like these broader issues for many, for 3 decades, and you for 4 plus.
Yeah.
The progress that I'm seeing happen in the courts now it's amazing relative to what was happening 2 decades ago when I was also paying attention to these things.
That's a good point. That is a bright spot. While I think the quality of our legislative and executive branch politics has declined substantially over the past 2 decades, I do think in the courts, things have they are better than they were
Mm-hmm.
in the late 80s, early 1990s.
Yeah, there's all these trend lines, and like you might say the quality of our built environment is going down, and the regulations around, the prohibitions on building really cool stuff are getting more and more. However, the challenges against those are going way up, and the success that they're having, the success with which those things are being challenged is going way up. So it feels a bit, I don't know, I don't want to say tipping point, but it feels like the winds are changing with regard to those things, and I'm optimistic in that regard. A topic, and God, there's so many things I want to talk to you about. But because this is top of mind, because I'm speaking to my favorite next week, I'm speaking to my favorite butcher philosopher, a guy named Michael Buckley, who's a butcher in California, super guy, about his industry. And one of the things I'm that's on my mind is think about Thomas Massey has been, and I can't remember who is co-sponsor of this. He has the Prime Act. Are you familiar with the Prime Act? Have you heard
I think I've heard of it. Remind me what it is.
Yeah, so he has been trying to push this through for a long time, and he and a Democratic Party co-sponsor, which would enable farmers to sell. It would lower the amount of USDA inspections required of beef in order to sell the goods, which is as it's set up right now. It's almost entirely prohibits a small farmer from bringing their product to market. So all the beef, or the 99% of the beef sold is sold by really large sort of industrial agriculture producers. Which I don't know if your grandparents were farmers or whatever. My great grandparents were farmers, and you could sell your beef at the local market. You can't do that anymore. And so that's anyway. I see that, and I'm like, people are. I don't know how long ago they started pushing that trying to advance that bill without luck, but it was, more than 5 years ago. And I think they were just had no traction. But now I think there's more and more and more support for that type of thing. And so I'm hopeful that's going to change. So.
I hadn't heard that. I'm a general. I don't admire many politicians. Thomas Massey is one of the few that I have some genuine respect for.
Hopefully he listens to this show and I can get him on.
Oh, okay. Well, no, he is a good guy, and that is a worthy piece of legislation. These inspection requirements are the prime example. They are the prime example of protectionist legislation, regulation masquerading as health benefits. Oh, we can't have Americans, we got to protect Americans from this awful beef. And even if I don't know how these particular regulations are written, but very often, the legislators and regulators are clever enough to make them neutral on their face, right? And they don't, of course, they don't say, we're going to give special advantage to, big beef, and in order to hurt, little meat. The costs that the producers have to incur to comply with these requirements, many of these costs are giant upfront fixed costs. Well, if you're a big beef producer, you can spread those costs over a lot larger amounts of output than you can if you produce smaller quantities of output per period of time. And so the costs fall disproportionately heavily on the smaller producers, thus giving the larger producers an advantage, a competitive advantage, an unfair competitive advantage. It's not a real competitive advantage; it's a government-engineered competitive advantage.
And that's the exact situation in the beef market. And not only does it confer advantage to the largest growers growing at largest producers producing at largest scale, but it also adds cost for everyone. But disproportionately more cost to the product sold by the small provider.
And
so it's like a yeoman theme. I wonder if I've not mentioned that topic in a single episode that I've done so far. Probably.
Well, it's a good theme, and it's shocking to discover. I'm fairly familiar with the history of regulation in the U.S., and it's shocking to discover how much regulation at the state, local, and national level is put in place for precisely this purpose. Of course, the language is always in the public interest. That's a given, but it doesn't take too much savvy and too much investigation to discover that imposing some regulatory requirement is going to differentially harm some smaller, politically less significant producers than the larger, politically more significant producers, thus giving a differential advantage to the larger producers. And they know it. They know what they're doing. Of course, they can't admit it publicly.
As a student of history, a professor of economics, and a holder of a law degree, looking back on our history, has that been a constant force in our regulatory and legislative environment, the push for corporatism, I would call it? Like, has it been constant, or was this something that sort of emerged in a big way, like in the late 1800s, or
it accelerated a lot in the late 1800s? There are periods of acceleration. It accelerated a lot in the late 1800s, accelerated again during the first few decades of the 20th century, accelerated, then another period of acceleration during the New Deal, and another period of acceleration in the 60s.
Massively 3 years ago.
And then most recently under Biden. Uh, I think even early on, what the difference 200 years ago was that the American ethos combined with the dominance of the common law then compared to now, we just got a lot less regulation. People look to the government to do a lot less, particularly at the national level.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but what little regulation we got, I mean, some of it was well intended. You know, clearing swamps of malarial
Mm-hmm.
waters. But I think even go back 200 years and randomly pick some regulation enacted by a state or local government, you're going to find special interest group politics behind it.
This may be a jag, but I feel like it's on the same theme, and I'm kind of putting you on a spot. But a topic I don't know, I know essentially nothing about, but a couple people when I've kind of been expressing uh, my general disdain for corporatism or whatever we would call it, they've called to my attention the special treatment we afford uh, corporations in the United States, and that is something I don't know. I don't know enough about to respond to that question at all. Can you help fill me in there?
Yeah. So I mean, the argument I think that you're referring to is the one that, well, corporations aren't real; they're creatures of the state. And here, literally in the United States, literally the state. Corporations in the U.S. are incorporated at the state level, and rather than at the national level. But they're not. There are official persons. You know, the U.S. Steel is not Jeff Graham. U.S. Steel doesn't have a brain. Doesn't have rights that can be. It doesn't have a will in the same way that you or I individually have a will. There's a history, and I'm not familiar enough with it to speak expertly on it. But under English common law, which was then brought to these shores hundreds of years ago, individuals were often able to get together and create, create business firms, create partnerships, and these businesses under common law, their rights were protected. The property rights were protected, contract rights were protected. Then there were these contracts that were entered into that by individuals in which they limited their liability. Now, this is not a problem. Limited liability is not a problem at all if we put aside tort law. So if I'm Don's corporation, and it's capitalized in $1 million, but my personal wealth is more than that, and you contract with me for me to do some service for you, and I violate the terms of the contract, costing you more than $1 million worth of damage. Well, because I'm incorporated, you're only entitled to get what the corporation is worth and no more. You can't go against my personal wealth. So that's the limited liability part. And in that case, you can say, well, the English common law, Anglo-American common law, presume that the contracting parties knew about the liability restrictions of the parties they were dealing with. It's a little bit different if I'm a corporation and one of my agents plows into you, kills you, inflicts damages upon you, monetary damages worth more than the value of the corporation. Your estate sues. It can only get the limited amount of the value of the corporation. So this is one complaint people have. I admit, it's from a libertarian perspective, this is a little bit of a challenge. On the other hand, limited liability corporations do allow the easy accumulation of huge amounts of capital that are very useful for making large-scale production, in lots of cases profitable, and I think beneficial for society as a whole. Ever since the latter part of the first half of the 19th century, state and corporation rules have been very open. So unlike until then, particularly in England, you got a corporate charter. It was almost a special privilege. Your corporate charter was specially granted, and it came with certain privileges that other people couldn't possibly get. One of the nice things about what happened in America, starting, it was boiling up in the first half of the 19th century, that the states were competing amongst each other to grant corporate charters. And so now getting a corporate charter is like getting a driver's license. Anyone can get one. You meet certain minimum requirements. And so they no longer come along with special privileges, which is a good thing. The extent to which the limited liability aspect of a corporation as regards protecting that corporation's owners from tort suits against people who were accidentally or negligently harmed by the agents of the corporation. I don't have a good answer to that. This is one of these challenges. I don't. So, I'm a radical libertarian, as I said. I don't like the notion that the state can create things and protect individuals from the consequences of their action. I mean, certainly you and I shouldn't be allowed to create a corporation, capitalize it at $1 million, and then negligently mow down an innocent person, inflict on their family damages much more than that, and say, oh yeah, we're off the hook. You can't come against our personal assets because we're capitalized only to the tune of $1 million. I don't know how to. It's a trade-off. I see this as a trade-off. I don't think the trade-off has been struck. It's not obvious to me that the trade-off has been struck in a terrible way.
I wonder. I think about when I was a child, and I would visit relatives in small rural towns, and you go down the main street and it's all these places that are owned by people in the town, and now it's Hardee's and CVS and Dollar General, and I've attributed that growth to sort of a number of things. I think zoning and transportation policy have a huge impact on those. Certainly the federal and state subsidy of the lengthening of supply chains kind of socializes the cost of infrastructure that a big box retailer is dependent on to do that. But other people have raised to me this point, like, well, also those corporations have protections that are that make it, and I haven't really drilled into that aspect of it, but intuitively it would make sense. Like, this is there might be something there to work into. So I wonder if the trade-off is a good one, certainly in, say, pharmaceutical manufacture with vaccines or oil drilling or whatever. Like, there's liability limitations.
Well, that's different. And that I think is inexcusable.
It is different. It seems like it's in this kind of broadly the same family, maybe, but more overt.
I think it's different in that so the corporation's treated as an artificial person, and any wrong done by that artificial person, all the assets owned by that artificial person are subject to being claimed by the victims who that artificial person harms. In the case of these vaccines, and I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that in the case of a lot of these vaccine liability limitations, these are on top.
This is a Reagan era, early Reagan era.
And I get here too. Someone can say, well, there's a trade-off. So vaccines are good, and so we need to give these extra. We need to protect big pharma from being sued if its vaccine turns out to give kids 3 eyes because we don't want to dissuade them from. It's just my intuition. I think that's a bad idea.
Yeah. The similar thing exists in with energy production. So
yeah,
natural disasters that occur as like Deepwater Horizon, the liability's capped.
yeah. I'm not in favor of well, as a presumption, strong presumption, I'm against liability caps.
Yeah.
But yeah, I understand the argument that people make. It's another difficult argument, and I'm glad you're not asking me about it. I'm going to mention it. I don't want you to ask me about it. But one of the things that in my blog, I largely don't stay away from any topic. I like pretty much all public policy.
No,
topics.
you're all over. It's you're broad in your coverage.
One topic that you'll notice I don't talk about is intellectual property.
Oh yeah. We're not allowed, I love that topic. We're not allowed to talk about it right now.
I find that to be very challenging. I understand arguments on both sides. And this is one of these deals when I hear a very competent, and there are many, very competent, say, supporter of intellectual property. I'm not talking about a hack. I'm talking about a really thoughtful, competent supporter of intellectual property. I go and think, oh, yeah, I'm convinced. And then 10 minutes later, I can hear a really competent opponent of intellectual property. I go, oh, yeah, I'm convinced. And I can't myself. I haven't yet made I don't have strong priors on that issue, and so I don't talk about it.
Well,
because I don't know. I don't know. I gather you have strong priors on it.
Well, my inclination, and I know I understand that Jefferson's views on this very topic changed through his life, but his most famous quote about he who lights his taper against mine, gets light without dampening my light. I should know that quote offhand.
I know I will say. Pardon me. I will say this. I do think of this. I'm confident. I do think that the application of intellectual property law today is excessive.
Right. Yes.
The length of patents, I believe, is too long. The length of copyrights is obsessively too long. But
is it Alex Tabarrok that he talked about he applied kind of the Laffer curve thing to IP? Like at some point, stronger IP protections, they help society, but there's a point.
Yeah.
We're probably after it. That it's
in terms of the application, I have no trouble saying that I think they're excessive. And I also said I wouldn't talk about the topic. The intellectual property issues that I have in mind are the ones that are legislatively established. There are intellectual property rules that evolved at common law that I have much less problem supporting. I mean, I think trade names are certainly a valid intellectual property. I can't start a restaurant and put out golden arches and make it look very much like McDonald's and start selling hamburgers. I think McDonald's does have and ought to have a right to protect its image, and the reason for that is not because I have any brief for McDonald's. It's because I believe that kind of intellectual property shields consumers from being duped, and it encourages businesses to develop strong credibility through their trade names. Trade names and brand names are assurances of product quality, which play an important role in the economy.
I can see a moral or similar argument too about just the nature of property. Like property becomes yours once you have defined it and improved it and invested in it and made it something. And a brand is one of those things.
Yeah. But in terms of patents and legislatively established copyrights, I find it to be intellectually super challenging.
Yeah. I guess I talk about. I'm pretty radical. I don't know that I still say libertarian, but I'm a pretty radical person. Maybe anarcho-utopian, neo-Luddite. whatever I am. I don't know,
I'm
but
certainly the Luddite, but I call myself a philosophical anarchist. Sure. Anyway,
yeah,
I'm sorry I interrupted you.
likewise. And I feel like I can get into intractable arguments with people when I'm talking about what it ought to be like how things ought to be.
Yeah.
But I feel like the discussion of in what direction should we head is a much easier one. Like, do we need stronger, more restrictive regulations than we have? Should we have more freedom than we do right now? Is intellectual property overly burdensome and gotten to the point where it's damaging or regressive or like those types of things? I feel like it's a lot easier for people to nod their head in agreement or us to be on the same page about something than for me to say like, you know, we should all live in an anarchist utopia.
Yeah. Yeah. I often have to counsel some of my younger libertarian friends who I meet. So, look, if you want to persuade someone, you're going into your church or having Thanksgiving dinner with your family. Don't lead off with, all right, let's legalize heroin.
Yeah, right.
I'm like Milton Friedman. I don't believe in drug prohibition, but I almost never. If someone asks me about it, I'll give them my reasons. But it's not something that I personally feel. I mean, they're not. They often turn people off. I mean, I'd prefer to persuade people first that minimum wage legislation harms the very people it's aimed at helping.
Mm-hmm.
To persuade people that well-meaning regulations that appear in their face to be well-meaning. Oh, we're going to protect the neighborhood from blight. It turns out to be not only to not achieve their goals, but they're just special interest rent seeking hiding behind a pretty label. And so, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of libertarian positions that I take and that I believe in, and I would, vote for if I voted, which I don't. That I don't think are particularly productive in popular discussion.
So, two things about that. You're bringing me to a question I wanted to ask you, which is about just like kind of normal people and their disposition on things, and how to speak with people about topics that you feel are really important in a constructive way with people who are not particularly radical. But I also want to put a pin in the you don't vote thing, and if you're willing to talk about that, I want to come back to that later. Yeah. It's timely. But so I think if a person only has a whole bunch of libertarian friends, then then it's not all that fun. And so it's great to have fun debate with all kinds of folks. But my general friends, like, they're a question they have. I'm like, we need to get rid of the Fed, and they're like, no, we don't need to get rid of the Fed. The Fed is this sort of moderating thing that actually does a really good job. And so I did have some questions from people who, when I shared I was speaking with you, I had some questions about this. So I want to turn to the Fed, and like a normal, everyday kind of centrist maybe person question asked is, hey, our last recession, 2008, financial crisis, some economists think the business cycle's fundamentally changed and is much more stable. We've had 16 years without a recession. Why is that? So, what's your take on that?
So let me preface what I'm about to say by saying that I'm not a monetary economist, and that monetary economics is, in my view, and in the view of a lot of economists, by far the most challenging single area in economics. It's devilishly difficult, which is why you have that's the area in economics where there's the greatest amount of disagreement among professional economists by far. It is definitely, and I am not a specialist in monetary economics. But you asked, and I'll give you an answer. I think that the Fed. So I mean, let me make this a longer answer than otherwise. I wish the Fed had never been created. It was created in 1913 and went into operation in 1914. My friend George Selgin, who is a spectacularly good monetary economist and monetary and banking historian, he and my colleague Larry White did a paper a number of years ago, along with Bill Straps at UGA. And this is an interesting finding. The U.S. dollar, between 1790 and 1913, lost 8% of its purchasing power. Now, there are a lot of variations over the years, but in 1913, the U.S. dollar could purchase roughly 92% of what a U.S. dollar could purchase in 1790, as far as you can compare what's available in those very different years. Between 1913 and I think 2010, the year the paper was published, 2011, the U.S. dollar lost 95% of its purchasing power. So to the extent that the Fed was established to stabilize the purchasing power of the dollar, it's been a spectacular failure. So that's the first thing to say. Just on that one front, it was a failure. On another front on which it was a failure was in 1930 and through 1933, prior to the establishment of the Fed, whenever there were bank panics and economic downturns, private bank clearinghouses, and sometimes the U.S. Treasury, they would somehow manage to get together and channel liquidity to those particular banks that were insolvent but not bankrupt, cash strapped but not, their net worth was still positive. And the Fed was established. One principal function of the Fed was to be this national institution that would provide liquidity in the case of banking panics. And the first real test the Fed got for that, it's a long, interesting history. Really advanced listeners will know that there was this test in 1920-21. I'm not going to talk about that. But everybody knows about the Great Depression. Right? So from 1930 to 1933, the money supply is dramatically falling. The Fed, given that we had a Fed, there's no question that the Fed then should have intervened to ensure that the money supply didn't decrease by 1/3, which is the amount by which it decreased between 1930 and 1933, or 30 and 32, I forget. It was a 3-year period. And so you can argue whether or not there should be a Fed. But given that there was a Fed at the start of the Great Depression, there's no doubt that the Fed's failure to do what everyone was expecting it to do, namely ensure that the money supply doesn't collapse, the fact that it did not do that for very ridiculous reasons, is a clear evidence that the Fed fell down big time on its job back then, making the Depression far deeper than it otherwise would have been. I think that's not the full explanation for why we had the Great Depression, why it lasted as long as it did, but that's an important reason for why we sunk into such a deep depression in the early 1930s. So since then, I think the Fed has been, part of that history. It was constrained in what it could do by its engagement with the International Monetary Fund and these institutions that were set up in the aftermath of World War II to deal with international trade. It's a very complicated story, but it did tie the Fed's hands somewhat. Since the early 1970s, we've been completely off the gold standard. The Fed's hands haven't been tied by anything other than its own discipline at keeping the money supply stable. The Fed went crazy in the 1970s. It dramatically increased the supply of money. We got the famous inflation of the 1970s, which I remember I was a young man. I remember very well. And then in 1980s, we get Paul Volcker as the chairman of the Fed, followed by Alan Greenspan. And we were lucky and I think it's just luck in this sense. Both of these guys and some of the other Fed board governors who were appointed along with them, people like Manley Johnson, for example, had enough personal integrity and understanding to not use the Fed politically. So they kept the dollar supply for many years relatively constrained, allowing for economic growth that we experienced starting from 1983, pretty much through the rest of the 20th century. We did have relatively moderate growth. When the .com bubble burst in 2000, 2001, I think Greenspan made a mistake. He made other earlier mistakes. I'm not a monitor. I'm not into history, but my colleague Larry White mentioned earlier in another context. He documents pretty clearly that the Fed allowed the money supply in the early years of the 21st century to grow excessively. That excessive growth of the money supply, which was an overreaction by Greenspan to the bursting of the tech bubble in the very first years of the century, that excess money supply combined with the Clinton administrations, especially instituting these policies designed to artificially drive up home ownership, caused the financial crisis of 2007 through 2009. This was not a crisis caused by deregulation. There's so many, like the Great Depression, there's so many fallacies that are current today about what caused the Great Recession. It was in my mind, no doubt, caused chiefly by a combination of loose monetary policy leading up to the Great Recession, with government housing policies.
As I recall, that was a painful period. But as I recall, those housing policies were probably intensified in the Clinton years, but they had begun way earlier.
So you had Clinton really ramped them up.
Effectively, and tell me if this is right, he was effectively telling banks to make loans to people that were not qualified.
Yeah, I know. I put the blame for that on Clinton. Government. Bill Clinton didn't start the era of bad government, for sure. And you had the Community Reinvestment Act, which dates back to 1977. So Jimmy Carter was in office.
That's what I was thinking of. Yeah.
Yeah, but that was largely moribund and didn't do much. Clinton, in 1992, he's campaigning for the presidency, and in his, all these candidates now, they write these, or they have ghostwritten for them, these campaign books laying out, their glorious vision for America's future. And one of the things Clinton mentions in this book, may have been co-authored with Al Gore, is how he's going to, dramatically increase home ownership. And in 1993, 94, he charges, of all people, Labor Secretary Robert Reich to try to get labor unions on board. He's got this scheme for using this this very obscure statute, the Community Reinvestment Act from 1977, the details are incredibly dense. But Clinton in 1992 and 1993 and 1994 certainly is responsible for ramping up government's efforts to use pension funds and private savings to artificially expand home ownership, and it backfired. I mean, it resulted in the Great Depression, and people like Barney Frank, they were complicit too in this. They all thought it was fantastic that the government under Bill Clinton was moving forward with basically socializing the risks of these under securitized mortgages. Again, I'm not an expert in this. It's a wonderful book.
Do you think that period? Go ahead. The excellent.
Well, I just mentioned it's a great one of the sources I'm relying upon is a book by Charles Calaveras and Steve Haber from about 10 years ago called "Fragile by Design," which gives it's an astonishing tale. Calaveras is a very famous and very respected economist at Columbia, and Haber's at Stanford, I think. And these guys just really detail the astonishing politics that went into driving up mortgage holdings in the 1990s and early 2000s.
Do you think that moment in the Clinton administration, was that the beginning of what we are seeing now, sort of much more mature, this enormous realignment of the Democratic Party? Do you know what I'm referring to? Kind of this movement of the Democratic Party toward being much more aligned with Wall Street and banking. Was that the beginning? I'm trying to think about when was Occupy Wall Street? When did that happen?
That was 2010, 2011.
So after that.
Yeah. So I'm not sure about that, Jeff. Maybe you're right. I do believe that the 2007, 2009 recession, and the unbelievably long time it took to recover. I mean, the recession formally ended, I think, in June of 2009.
Mm-hmm.
But unemployment remained very high for years afterward.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And the tale that was told was that this was greed combined with deregulation.
Yeah.
And that I think if you have to formally mark the end of the period. So I turned 22 in 1980, and Milton Friedman's a TV star. He has his own show on PBS. Ronald Reagan's elected president.
Crazy to imagine. Like, that's just crazy to imagine.
Yeah. Jimmy Carter and Ted Kennedy, of all people, in the late 1970s were deregulating. Mm-hmm. The Berlin Wall comes crashing down in 1989. The Soviet Union peacefully dissolves itself in 1991. The end of history and all that. And people would say, Bill Clinton himself, the end of the era of big government's over. Famous socialist economists were saying, Ludwig von Mises was right. Socialism doesn't work. Things are looking great. And that really ended with the 2007, 2009 recession. Finally, the left now has again a historical instance to identify as evidence for the failure of capitalism. Before that, it was the Great Depression. And that got kind of stale by the 1980s or even the 1970s. And then along comes the Great Recession, which, although nowhere nearly as severe as the Great Depression, was pretty bad. And it lent itself to these simplistic, sophomoric, mostly wrong-headed tales of greed run amok, deregulation run amok, and so my gosh, let's and before that you had people forget now that we had the Enron scandal of 2001. That was a prelude to this. So I think that the Great Recession, as it's now called, of 15 years ago, intellectually continues to contribute a lot to the difficulty that those of us on the limited government, pro-freedom side are now having making our case.
Well, as I recall, you also had prior to, I mean, Bush was leaving office. Was Bush leaving office right at that time?
He left in 2009.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and he had been, um, but I would say he kind of shared some culpability in aggressive response and interventionist response. It seemed like a bipartisan effort to sort of.
The Fed overreacted to it for sure. And again, that's my view. You have economists who think that the Fed didn't do enough, but Bush, it more or less happened on Bush's watch. He did some things, the details of which now escape me, that I disapproved of. But I really think that the seeds of this were planted by Clinton and the Fed during Clinton's and Bush's time in office. And then Obama's policies slowed the recovery. It was the slowest recovery America's ever had, other than that from the Great Depression. And Obama spent more. One of the many fallacies that are out there is, the recovery was so slow because the U.S. government refused to spend enough to stimulate the recovery. The simple facts refute that. The spending as a portion of GDP under Obama in those years grew and was significantly higher than was the spending relative to GDP after the very deep early 1980s recession, for example. So we had this very deep early 1980s recession. The unemployment rate in the early 1980s actually went higher than it did during the Great Recession. The Great Recession, the unemployment rate peaked at 10%. During the 1980s recession, it peaked at 10.8%. But Reagan's policies were one that, relative spending restraint, relative monetary restraint, and continuing with the policies of deregulation. You get the opposite under Obama. And I don't believe it's a coincidence that the recovery from the very deep, in a sense deeper, in some ways deeper, early 1980s recession, which we forget now. We don't call it the Great Recession. That recovery was so quick because the policies following it were so much better, so much more open, so much more conducive to free enterprise than were the policies following the formal end of the 2007-2009 recession.
Can we skip ahead a decade and a half to bring us to today?
Sure.
We talked a little bit before about the present fiscal incontinence. Can you draw a line from what you're describing then to where we are now?
Yeah. The norms have broken down. And I do think norms, unlike a lot of economists, I actually do think norms play a role even in politics. The norms have the norms for fiscal responsibility have steadily declined and deteriorated over my lifetime. They were deteriorating certainly during LBJ's time in the White House. They were deteriorating during the 70s, deteriorating even under Ronald Reagan, despite his rhetoric. Clinton, people will say Clinton balanced the budget. Well, we did have 4 years of surpluses under Bill Clinton. Um, I attribute that more to luck. The tech sector was booming. It created increases in productivity, which raised tax revenues surprisingly high.
This
To an
was
eight.
internet,
Yeah,
internet.
stuff. Yeah, um, and um, but since then, but at least through the first decade of the 20th century, at least politicians, some in both parties, spoke of fiscal responsibility. They don't even speak of it today. It's
Do you
not a
think?
thing.
Do you think that erosion that you call it of norms? I, one of the things I've been thinking about a ton over the last few years is time preference,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
and and how monetary policy affects time preference. And I wonder too, and so we are in a period I would guess most people would characterize as very high time preference. Um,
look, if we're all going to die 2 days from now, let's just
yeah,
spend madly and not worry about the future debt because it's not going to hurt anyone. Yeah, and
yeah.
that would be really high time preference.
Do you think that time preference with regard to monetary decisions or economic decisions? Do you think it also has affected people, politicians in particular, but I guess probably anybody, with regard to their manners or their norms or their general integrity or those sorts of things? Would
Yeah,
that be a stretch?
no, I don't think so. I don't think it's a stretch at all. I think that well, I'll put it this way: I think that the seems to be the current dominant norm on Capitol Hill today is uh, uh, government indebtedness simply doesn't matter. It's free. It's if we can spend whatever we want, and the quaint notion of paying for things as we go, of worrying about the debt burden that we're going to hand future taxpayers. That quaint notion seems to me largely completely missing. Maybe someone like Tom Massey has it. Maybe someone like Rand Paul has it. But certainly neither of the presidential candidates have it. Trump doesn't care about it. Kamala Harris doesn't care about it. I don't get any sense that Tim Walz and J.D. Vance care about it. And so we don't even have people in high positions of political authority even giving lip service to fiscal responsibility. Um, it's a big question, Jeff.
What do you think will be the impact of if you were to have to make a prediction? I hate to ask you to make a prediction, but
Yeah. I
what
think
sort of pressure does it create?
I
Or
think it's a matter. I think it's a matter of arithmetic. Who's the famous? There was a famous. I think it's Hemingway or something. So I said, well, something like
oh yeah,
uh, you know,
bankruptcy. How'd you get back?
bankruptcy. It comes slowly and then it comes all of a sudden. Um, we Americans are very lucky. We still, by and large, I think largely because of the norms we have in private lives. We're very entrepreneurial. We have the free market can take a lot of beating and still keep working and still keep producing, which is a great thing. And the size of our economy, the dynamism of our economy, that ensures that the dollar is still in high demand worldwide, which that fact is in a way good for us, but it is key to allowing the federal government to spend madly because there's always a market for U.S. government bonds. I'll take the bonds. The government's going to repay. Um, I hesitate to give a time,
Sure.
but to me it seems to be arithmetically impossible for us to continue to increase the debt at the rate at which we're increasing it, both the general debt and the entitlement program debt that we have, without there being a reckoning.
There could be, I would say, to like, if I were something that could stave off a reckoning, or would be enormous amounts of innovation.
Yes.
So
Yes.
with regard to energy, or maybe we will see a significant
Yes.
impact and with artificial intelligence or whatever it is, or something totally different, or
Yes.
maybe, whatever it is.
It's happened in the past. It can happen. It's a race. We're basically in a race between the astonishing productive powers of the modern global economy, and the astonishing fiscal incontinence of particularly politicians in Washington. And because debt to be repaid, for it to have any meaning, ultimately people want, when they get repaid, they want to buy goods and services. That's what it means to be repaid. They're just not looking for the paper. They're looking for the, go out and buy a new house, go buy a new car, send my grandchildren to college. And if those real goods and services aren't produced in sufficient quantity to allow the people who are repaid to consume as they think they're going to consume, then there's going to be trouble. We other governments have hit fiscal walls and they had to pay the price. Because we're the United States, it's a gigantic economy. The dollar is the global reserve currency. That makes the wall that we're heading for more distant, makes it a little bit more elastic. It maybe makes it more movable than it would be for a country like, say, Greece or Venezuela, for sure. But no matter how big or powerful we are, we're not immune to the laws of arithmetic.
I wonder if there's maybe a third thing too. Am I counting correctly? But we, an enormous, like I would say, innovation could be something that could stave off that reckoning.
Yeah.
But if it were conceivably possible, and I see winds of change in this regard, to lower the sclerotic impediments to commerce, trade, markets that are there, I just think about how much more we could enjoy with less effort.
My colleagues at the Mercatus Center have a new project that they're launching. It's called the Abundance Program, something like that. And it's exactly this. There are areas in our economy that, to any reasonable-minded person, are hamstrung by unreasonable amounts of regulation and taxes, energy,
healthcare, construction, two totally obvious ones. Yeah.
Yes, and just remove those burdens. That's all you need. You need the subsidies. We don't need plans. We don't need industrial policies. We don't need monetary. So just remove those burdens, and move us closer to what my former Mercatus Center colleague Adam Thierer calls a permissionless economy, by which he means let entrepreneurs do what they do, rather than first having you get sign off by some politician in a state capitol or city hall or some bureaucracy in DC. And so just move us closer to it being a permissionless economy. Let entrepreneurs be more free to offer their wares to consumers, to experiment with different ways to produce things, to produce different things.
I know it's been in the news, but just the dramatic decline in the cost of hearing aids is a perfect example of that. Like, someone asked on Twitter, where else might we be able to see this sort of thing? And my response to that is everywhere.
Yeah.
Like, literally everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, I know we're getting near the end probably,
Yeah.
but we can end on get closer to the end, an optimistic note. I mean, I do think that for all of the problems that we have, I mean, you mentioned an optimistic note earlier. This one doesn't contradict that. But for all the problems that we have, and I do think the fiscal situation that we face now is a real problem, much bigger than most people understand it to be. But on the other side of that, we are part of this astonishingly productive global economy. Humanity's known nothing like it before. And it includes, of course, Americans, but we're only 4% of the global population. It also includes lots of other people around the world. And so you do have this greater outpouring of entrepreneurial energies that, to the extent that we trade openly with people in other countries, allows not only them to benefit from our creativity and energy, but allows us to benefit from theirs. And that's happening. That's happening now. This one example, you mentioned the hearing aids. For many years, decades, there was in place something called the multi-fiber agreement. This was especially of interest to people in the Carolinas and Georgia. This was an agreement that protected textile producers from competition from lower wage textile producers in other countries. And the multi-fiber agreement was finally allowed to expire. I forget when, not that long ago. And the prices of clothing in the United States have come down tremendously since the end of the multi-fiber agreement. So you just got rid of that one restraint on trade. These things happen, in a sense, they happen slowly. But if you think about, if you look at the price of clothing today, go to Amazon and look at shirts and pants and jeans, or wherever your favorite, Walmart, wherever your favorite clothing place is, t-shirts, underwear, and look at the cost of these things compared to what they were 20 years ago before the multi-fiber agreement was dismantled. They're extremely lower today.
Well, can I challenge you on that? And not, this is in no way a defense of a multi-fiber agreement or anything like that, but how much of those costs are, my view, I don't hear many people talking about this. I would like someone to either tell me I'm wrong or help me flesh this out. But we have through an enormous amount of federal spending and policy, we've created a very long, very fast, very smooth supply chain. Like we've essentially gotten a whole bunch of Americans to buy or to guarantee debt to fund an enormous supply chain that moves very quickly. Like you drive from Charleston north and you drive over a giant, really tall bridge that's paid for by Americans so that enormous ships can drive underneath it or boat underneath it. And I wonder how much of those costs are the direct cost to the consumer is low, but is the fully loaded cost when you include the entirety of our interstate highway system, our port infrastructure, all those sorts of things, is it really lower?
Yeah, I suspect it is. I mean, I know what you're saying, and you and I have both already confessed that we have anarcho sympathies.
Yeah.
And so, if you're true no government person, anarchy means no government, doesn't mean chaos. True no government person, well, then there's no role for government to create a highway system. We live in a world with government. We're always going to live in a world with government, sadly. And I think there are reasonable debates that can be had among reasonable people about, what is an appropriate, given that we're in this world, what's an appropriate use for government in terms of creating infrastructure. And obviously, any infrastructure government creates is going to make it easier, and meaning less costly, for some people to carry out their activities if those activities involve the use of that infrastructure.
Yeah.
And so there's no doubt that building the highway system, maintaining the highway system, lowers the cost to retailers and wholesalers and producers,
particularly those operating at scale.
Particularly those operating at scale. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we had the interstate highway system long before the multi-fiber agreement went out of effect. And the bridge in Charleston, I think, was there long before. I think the multi-fiber agreement was in effect. I think it went out of effect in like 2007, something like that. I could be wrong on the exact date. But I think the two issues can be kept separate.
I agree with that. Yeah.
And so, given that we have these highways, given that we have the bridge, there's no reason, whether we have them or not, to have these further obstructions put on the ability of American clothing manufacturers to buy foreign-made textiles, or the ability of American retailers and wholesalers to buy foreign-made clothing to sell at lower costs to Americans.
I would say, yes, that makes sense. And also the manner in which people use the infrastructure that the public has paid for, the way they ought pay for the ability to use that ought to change in a way to better reflect the benefit they receive and the cost.
To the extent that per unit pricing would be implemented, would be far better than just, the closer, this is just true for everything. I think all economic phenomena, the more closely you can align benefits and costs to personal decisions, the better off the outcomes are going to be. And so if the government is just taking general tax revenue and building gigantic highways and then allowing free access to those highways, there's a huge disconnect between the cost people are paying for them and the benefit they're getting from them. You can't expect it to be highly efficient. But if the government or some agency, doesn't have to be a government really, if it's just funding a highway system out of a combination of monies it raises from private investors and tolls that it collects from the individual users, as not given, importantly, not given the power to use eminent domain to confiscate land over which the highways are built, then we can anticipate that highway would be much more efficient by almost any measure than would the first kind of government built highway using general funds.
Right.
Yeah. But unfortunately, the latter is what we have. And given that we have it, I don't see any point in tearing it up.
Yeah, I want to. At some point, I need to find a legal someone who understands the history of that. There's a 1907 decision, Wilson versus Shaw, that and they empowered the federal government to begin making internal improvements, which had been forbidden by the Constitution up until that point. That's an episode I would like to have, and I haven't found the person who really understands that history to go into it. You promised me less time than you've given me, and because of the season that we're in, and if you have a few more minutes, because it's a topic that's fascinating to me, and we're in the season, could we wrap up sharing your perspective on voting?
So I said earlier, you want to put a pin in it. I don't mind. I said I don't vote. I have voted in a political election. I mean, I vote a lot. I was in a department faculty meeting yesterday. I voted there. But I don't. The last political election I voted in was in 1977. I think I was 19 years old. It was a local election in Louisiana. I don't vote because I find politics to be so distasteful. That's the main. I just find it distasteful. I have never encountered a candidate that I felt enthusiastic enough to vote for. Voting, of course, does take time and energy. My vote, it's true, my vote's not going to swing the election. Now, I understand that the vast majority of people find what I just said to be offensive. Oh, that's no excuse not to go into a voting booth. But for me, my time is valuable, and I do play a role, however modest it is, in the political discussion. I do have a political voice. I do it in my blog. I do it in my writing. I'd rather spend time writing a blog post, writing a letter to the editor, writing an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal, than spending my time waiting in line to yank a lever for some candidate that I actually disapprove of. And then when you think of voting, you say, well, it's your political voice. Well, it's a really, really, really stunted voice. You go into the voting booth and you yank a lever. What are you signaling? Okay, you're signaling that you prefer the candidate whose lever you pulled more than you prefer the candidate or candidates whose levers you didn't pull. But do you prefer that person by a lot, by a little? Are you voting for candidate Smith because you think candidate Smith is actually good, or are you voting for candidate Smith simply because you don't want candidate Jones to be elected? And so I just find politics to be distasteful, and I don't like to engage in distasteful activities. It boils down to that. It's a personal thing. I don't like having my intelligence insulted. Maybe that makes me arrogant. Yeah. I never look at political speeches. I don't listen to the president when he delivers the State of the Union address.
And that's me so painful.
I would literally rather stick needles in my chin than watch a presidential debate, because I can't stand having my intelligence insulted. And so the fact that I would glorify these people with standing in line to cast a ballot for one of them, I just can't do it. And I don't have any moral qualms about not being. I don't criticize people who do vote, by the way. Yeah. But I just don't do it. It's an activity that I don't gamble. I don't criticize people who gamble. I find gambling to be distasteful. I don't gamble. I find politics to be distasteful. I don't do politics at the participatory level.
I have so much affinity for that position, and I would say I've wavered in it from time to time. But an additional thing you didn't say that I feel like is in going to do it, I feel like a voter is expressing they're buying a product. The process, they're going out and they're demonstrating that this process has been good for them. Mm-hmm. And I have this additional feeling, and I'm with you, essentially everything you shared, that the best way to express dissatisfaction with the process is to not participate in the process.
In a way, not voting is voting. It's mm-hmm. saying I think the process stinks, and I do think the process stinks. People will say, I'm sure you've heard this. You hear it all the time. Well, if you didn't vote, you don't have a right to complain. And I think, if anything, it's the opposite. If you agree to play a game and you lose, you and I agree to play poker together, and I lose, it would be childish of me to complain about the outcome. I agreed to play by the rules, and I lost. In fact, precisely because I refuse to play the game, I think I have the right to complain. If I go to the voting booth and my candidate wins, well, I certainly have no right to complain. Yeah. If I go to the voting booth and my candidate loses, well, I've agreed to play by those rules. I still have no right to complain. Mm-hmm. I don't go to the voting booth. I reserve to myself, thereby, the right to complain.
You're echoing Dan Carlin, that bit by Dan Carlin.
Oh, really? Okay. Well,
Median, yeah, I'll send it to you. It's
okay.
He's funny. So what are you teaching in a little bit? I need to let you go.
I teach. I love doing this. I've been doing this since I was in graduate school at Auburn. I teach a big auditorium class, mostly freshmen, principles of microeconomics. It's popularly called Econ 101, and George Mason's Econ 103. And I have 300. I have a big auditorium, 328 students in the auditorium. Again, mostly freshmen. This semester, I'm doing 2 of these classes back to back. So from 1:30 until 1:30 until 2:45, I'm doing one, and then again from 3 o'clock to 4:15, I'm doing another one, repeating the same lecture. It is. I just love doing it. I love introducing young people to the economic way of thinking. And, I often, whenever we travel, anybody travels, you get in conversations. Well, what do you do? I'm an economics teacher. And I can't tell you how many times people tell me, when they're not just saying, oh, well, that's interesting. When they give a substantive response, they'll say, oh, I hated my economics course.
Huh.
And I have a sincere response to that I give all the time. And I mean it. So, well, you had a very bad economics professor. I don't know who she was. And unfortunately, there are a lot of bad economics professors in the world. I fancy that I'm not one of them. I fancy that I'm reasonably good at it. That's all I do. I mean, that's basically what I do. And the economy is an incredibly fascinating thing. You mentioned iPencil earlier. We live in this world in which every day we routinely consume things that not only did we not make ourselves, I didn't make my cell phone, I didn't make this pencil that I have here, and they were made for us by strangers, and there are things that nobody knows how to make. No one mind contains all. That's exciting to explain. This is the world we live in, and to share insights about how strangers, hundreds of millions of strangers, spread around the globe, are incited and informed every day to go to work, to do what they do, and to have the results be not perfect, but so spectacularly, let's face it, they're not perfect, but my gosh, they're great. You flip the switch, the light goes on. You press the button, the toilet flushes. You press another button, you can talk to your sibling who lives on the other side of the world. Press another button, your car starts, and you can drive to where you're going, even to the protest to complain about capitalism and how it doesn't work.
Right.
And we it works so well, we take it for granted. Let me end on this. A lot of my fellow economists will say it's a standard economist explanation for why we have government. This is true even among market-oriented economists. Well, we have government because of market failure. There are externalities, pollution, and so when these happen, government has to rush in and fix them. And I have a completely opposite view. We have a lot of government, not because of market failure, but because of market success. The market works so well, so smoothly, so quietly. It never sings its own praises, that it gives us, those of us who live in it, it gives us the impression that, well, things could be even better. And of course, they can be even better. And when there's a tiny hiccup, we think the world's going to hell. Oh, I went to the supermarket and they had no toilet paper. Terrible. We have to pass a law. We need government to intervene. And so precisely because the market works so well, people lose sight of how well it works. And they get this misimpression somehow that giving people in state capitals and national capitals the power to coerce us will make things even better. And I think that's a really wholly mistaken. I like to teach. I want my students to leave my class in a state of wonder at how well the market routinely delivers to them things that they take for granted. So,
that's brilliantly put.
Well, thank you.
Professor Boudreaux, thank you so much for joining me on Yeoman. I encourage you, our listeners, to follow Professor Boudreaux's work on Cafe Hayek. Google his name. He's got plenty out there to write in all kinds of publications. Don, thank you. I hope you enjoy class this
Thank
afternoon.
you, Jeff. I hope my students enjoy class. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.